Awesome. Okay, we're at 5:01. So let's get cracking. Anyone who's joining us a little bit later, this session is being recorded as always, so they'll be able to catch up and maybe skip out the little bit of waffly intro at the beginning that we normally do. So first things first, for anyone who's joining us today for the first time, let's just do a quick round of intros and a super quick 3 slides just to get you settled before we get started. So my name's Patrick. I work here at Boolean UK. And as I said yesterday, doing kind of everything that isn't teaching related. So helping out on the admissions and placement side predominantly. And I'm here with Ed and Nathan. Do you want to introduce yourselves both?
Hi folks, my name is Edward. I'm head of teaching here at Boolean UK. It's lovely to have a number of you back here on this session to build Tic-Tac-Toe. I have with me Nathan, who's one of our other fantastic teachers. Nathan, do you want to introduce yourself?
Hi everyone, I'm Nathan. I'm one of the teachers, like Ed says. I'm going to be taking you through the session this afternoon, building Tic-Tac-Toe. Looking forward to it.
Yeah, me too. So super quickly, we've already said hello to our teachers. We've already had 2 sessions this week. Some of you will have been around for the HTML and CSS on Monday, and many of you have been here yesterday as well for the introduction to JavaScript. As Nathan said, and as we've said on the messages we've been sending, today we're doing our first project, which is Tic-Tac-Toe, or as some of you may know it, noughts and crosses. So we're going to be using the technologies and the tools we've learned over the last 2 days, putting those into practice with Tic-Tac-Toe today. For the rest of the week, we've got the open day tomorrow. Super excited to talk a bit more detail about our full-time courses and our part-time courses at Boolean tomorrow with some of the students as well. And then we'll be wrapping things up with the final project on Friday with Space Invaders, and that's back with Ed taking that one. So as a super quick reminder, just about the open day tomorrow, we have 3 courses. We have our full stack software development, which is a full-time 6-month course. We have a front-end development course, which is a full-time 3-month course. And we also run a part-time data analytics course, which is 6 months, evenings and weekends. All of those courses are live and online, so you can learn, from the home, anywhere around, live as well, so live classes with live teaching. All of them come with 6 months of career support to try and help you find a job afterwards. And for all of them, we have various financing options available. We're not going to go into too much detail today, but come along tomorrow if you're interested in continuing your coding journey, or indeed if you're interested in looking into a data journey tomorrow. We're looking forward to that. Useful things to know, as always, these sessions are being recorded. We're going to be posting the link the following day, usually around sort of lunchtime, early afternoon. It's all on our YouTube, so that's the link to head to. Just head to the YouTube channel. Ed has also created a repo with all of the resources on here as well. So if you want to look at the code, that's been shared on our Discord channel, and it will also be shared in an email with you. So and we can also post a link in the chat, so you can access the code as well and kind of really go over it again. We've mentioned you get a certificate if you complete the week. I know there's been lots of questions about this. We'll be sending out the form about halfway through today's session, and then again at the end. Just fill in that form and that'll be your register for attendance. There's no sort of like confirmation email or anything. So just when you finish that form, it'll say thank you, and that's all logged, all good. And that is for attending all the lessons, not including Monday, because obviously Monday we had some of you that weren't able to join when we hit our capacity limit. Third thing, we talked about getting interactive. Some of you might have already seen this yesterday with JavaScript. The pace can sometimes move a little bit quickly, especially if you're brand new to this. If you're not brand new to this, you've done a little bit before, please feel free to code along. Please feel free to continue jumping in with your questions and asking us. We'll do our best to answer as many of them as possible. If you're absolutely brand new and you find yourself falling behind, don't worry too much about keeping up. Instead, what we kind of really recommend is just like sit back and enjoy it, kind of watch it, get inspired, and know that tomorrow you'll be able to watch this back, keep pausing, keep slowing it down, and kind of go over it like line by line in real detail to make sure that you fully understood everything, just in order to keep to the 2-hour time frame. Sadly, we're not able to kind of, we're trying to go as a decent speed so that people can keep up, but sometimes that might mean you're getting a little bit lost, but don't worry too much. You'll be able to watch it back, you'll be able to code back. And of course, on the full-time course, we have a lot more time to do all of this stuff. We usually do HTML and CSS and JavaScript over, I think, the first 5-6 weeks. So rather than sort of 2 2-hour lessons. And of course, as we said, if you're hungry for more and you're ready to take the next step, you can apply to join one of our courses today. And we'd love to see you on one. Those are all the slides. I'm going to stop talking, stop sharing, and I'll hand over to Nathan to take it away.
Okay.
Fantastic. Nathan, before you begin, just a quick note. We have opened up the Q&As. So if you look in your Zoom menu bar at the bottom for Q&As, you can ask questions and feel free to do so. But everyone can now see all the questions. So definitely have a look through the questions, see if there's anything that's already been asked that's similar to your question. And if you see another question you can answer yourself, feel free to get engaged and do that. And I'll also be monitoring the questions. So as we go, please use that, and we'll pause occasionally to go through some questions. And otherwise, it's quite hot, as Patrick says, definitely bottle up with some water and enjoy the next couple of hours. Nathan.
Thank you, Ed. Thank you, Patrick. Let me go ahead and share my screen here and we'll get started. I have my window open because it's very hot today. So if there starts to be a bunch of background noise, I'm going to ask Ed to please just interrupt me and tell me to shut my window. Otherwise, I'm going to assume it's fine. Let's go back. So we're going to be building Tic-Tac-Toe today using HTML, JavaScript, and CSS. Those are the things we've covered this week. This is going to get a little bit more complex. So yesterday and the day before, we covered kind of a high-level overview of the core concepts without going into really too much detail because we're under a bit of a time pressure. And as Patrick says, we usually teach these skills over a number of weeks. So we're condensing a lot of information into a couple of hours. So please don't be too hard on yourself. You're not going to come out of this being able to build the next AAA game. But this is a really good starting point and a good way to kind of demystify things and show that it's not some magic thing that nobody can achieve. It's a very achievable skill. And it doesn't even take that much code to build Tic-Tac-Toe. We only end up with maybe 150 lines. That's all. If you'd like to follow along with this, there are two methods you can use. One of them is by using Code Sandbox. The other is using a text editor and a web browser of your choice. I'll show you how to get both of those set up very briefly. Tic-Tac-Toe involves pretty much everything that an interactive website will have. So you'll display something on the screen, you'll change things based on what the user clicks, what the user does. Pretty much every website does that. So these are the three stages we're going to go through. So we're not just going to start writing code blindly until we end up with a functional app. The first thing we need to do is create some kind of grid for Tic-Tac-Toe. We need a 3x3 grid. We're going to create some really big, easy to see blue squares. So nothing too fancy. Once we have that, we're going to move into the second phase where we're going to add some logic for filling these squares with an X or an O. So this is where we come to making things clickable and changing things on the screen based on user events. And finally, once we've done all that, we're going to add the finishing touches, create some conditions for what happens when we win, what happens when we draw. And we'll create a nice big red banner to show the user that the game's finished. So those are going to be the three stages. We're going to use CSS, HTML, and JavaScript for this. All right, so let me just give a brief intro to Code Sandbox. So the people that want to use Code Sandbox can follow along. You can go to codesandbox.io, or you can type Code Sandbox into your browser, into your favorite search tool, and it will be the top result. When you're on the Code Sandbox page, in the top right-hand corner, there is a Create Sandbox button. I'm going to click that. You don't need to create an account. And I'm going to be presented with this screen here. I might have a Create Sandbox button here. I'm going to click this blue button, and then I'm going to have to choose a template. So what I'm going to choose here is static. I'm going to choose the static template, the one with the orange shield with a 5 in it. That's going to bring me to this page, which has 3 columns. On the left-hand side, you have a list of files. We have an index.html file. We're going to need that. You can ignore package.json and sandbox config.json. We don't need to ever touch those. What we're going to do is we're going to create a couple of files that we're going to need for this session. So over here at the top of this left-hand column, there is a down arrow, an up arrow, and something that looks like a little page with a little folded corner. I'm going to click that, and that will give me a new input over here. In this input, I'm going to type index.js. I'm going to press enter, and that's going to create a JavaScript file for me. I'm going to do the same thing, click the page, and in this input now, I'm going to type style.css. That's going to be our style sheet, our CSS file. Next thing I'm going to do is just double click index files and double click the style file, just so I have them open in my 3 tabs here. Then on the left-hand side, there is another page icon here with the folded corner, a bit bigger, this one. I'm going to click that, and that's going to hide my file explorer, just to get it out of the way. If I want to bring it back, I can click that again, and there it is. Now we're going to need some HTML to begin with. We're not going to write it all out by hand. Ed is going to share a link to this in the Zoom chat for you. So we're going to end up with this bit of HTML here. Please go to that link, grab all of this HTML and copy it to your clipboard. Head over to Code Sandbox, and you're going to replace everything in the indexed HTML file with that HTML that we've given you. And that's going to give us a nice starting point. We're not going to do anything with index.js or style.css like this. Most of the code we write is going to be in index.js and style.css. We'll make some changes to index.html, but this is a nice little starting point. And I will go through what's in here in just a moment. So that's how we get us set up on Code Sandbox. If you're using a text editor, you're going to create the same 3 files in any directory you want: index.html, index.js, style.css. And then you're just going to find the file on your file explorer. And if you find your index.html file, right-click it, and you want to open it with your web browser. So it could be Brave, Firefox, Internet Explorer, Edge, Chrome, whatever you use. I'm using Brave, so I can just go ahead and click and open it up with Brave. You'll just see a white screen, but you should see a very long path to the file in your URL bar. So that's how we're going to do it with a text editor on our local machines. Before we get into writing some code, I'm going to show you the finished result. But before I show you the finished result, I'm going to show you what you're going to do on Friday. Space Invaders. You're going to be building this with Ed. So I can move around here. I can shoot some Space Invaders. You'll see that my score's going up on this side over here. Space Invaders are moving down. And then when they get to the bottom, they're going to spark a game over message. I think I'll just let them meander over here a little bit. And here we go. Game over with a nice little retro font. I love this font. So there's Space Invaders. We're going to be building Tic-Tac-Toe today. So this is the finished result. We have our 3x3 grid. We can click in this grid and we end up winning Tic-Tac-Toe. And if we do the same thing, but we end up with a draw, we get a nice little draw message. So this is what we're going to be building today. Okay. So I have my blank screen, my index.html file open in my browser. First thing I'm going to do is I'm going to right click. I'm going to click inspect, and I'm going to open up the developer tools. I'm going to need this from time to time. It's good to have this handy. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to open up the console section of this. And I'm just going to move this over here to give myself some space, just so I can see things rendering on the page. And now I'm going to jump to my editor, and we're going to get started. So in this HTML file, we've got a bunch of stuff within the head tag. We're going to ignore these meta tags. These are just kind of the default stuff that pretty much every website has to help you scale the page correctly. The things that are important in here is this line right here, the link tag. This has a rel attribute. And we've set the value of that to style sheet. And the hypertext reference of that is our CSS file, style.css. So if you created this file with a different name, this is where you would change that value. The next line here, we have a script tag. So this script tag has an src attribute. This points to our index.js file. So this is how we're loading JavaScript into our web page. And we have a little defer property on this, a little defer attribute. We don't need to worry too much about this. This just makes sure that the JavaScript loads after our HTML is loaded. The main thing we want to look at here is this div. Within the body, we have a div tag, and I've already added a game class to it. So I've given a class to this div, and I've called it game. Now, I've not got any styles for this class yet, but we will be adding some. So I guess the first thing we want to do is we want to create some kind of grid that we can see on the screen. So this is where we're going to create some HTML and some CSS, and then we'll improve things as we go. So the first thing I'm going to want is I'm going to want 3 divs and 3 of those. So I want 9 divs in total. I want 3 on the top, 3 on the middle, 3 on the bottom. The way I'm going to do that is just by simply creating a div and giving it a class, and I'm going to call this class cell. I'm just going to copy and paste this line 8 more times. So I end up with 9 divs inside of my game. I'm going to head back to my page, and I'm not going to see anything on here because I haven't added any style or any content or anything like that. But if I open up my elements inspector, I'll see in here now I've got my game div followed by 9 cells that I just haven't got anything inside. So let's start making things look a bit better. I'm going to head over to my style.css, and there's a few things I'm going to get set up. Pretty much every time you create a style sheet, you'll apply an overall style to everything, just to kind of reset the margins, reset the paddings, and get yourself into a default state. We're not actually going to see any changes on the screen yet, but these are just things I like to do to get things set up. So I've got a little star here as my class. This is just a wildcard that says apply this style to everything. So I'm just going to set the margin to 0. I'm going to set the padding to 0. I'm going to set a box sizing property to border box. We don't need to worry too much about this. And I'm going to set the font family to something that I want to see. So I don't want to see Times New Roman on my screen. I don't like that font. I'm going to use sans serif. This is the font we're going to use. If I head back to my browser, we haven't actually done anything on the page, but we will get there. Okay, so the next thing I want to do, I'm going to create a cell CSS class. And for this cell, I'm going to give it a background color. And I'm going to set the background color to a hex code. I'm going to use a hashtag, and I'm going to use Boolean's blue. Boolean's blue is 3535EC. I made a note of this. I didn't just remember Boolean's hex code. Nobody remembers hex codes. I'm going to jump back to my screen, and again, we haven't got anything on the page yet. It's fine. That's expected. We haven't added any sizes or anything like that. There's no content in our HTML. I'm going to add another CSS class here called game. And I'm just going to give some style to our overall game div here. So first thing I'm going to do, I want a size for my game. I want to make sure my game's going to be big enough. I want it to display as a grid. So let's start with displaying it as a grid. Let's just do display grid. I'm going to jump back to my page. Still, we have nothing. So the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to tell my grid how many columns I want and how big they should be. So I'm going to say grid template columns. And I'm going to use a repeat function. So we can think of this kind of like a function in JavaScript. This takes a couple of parameters. How many times do I want to repeat? 3. And I want to make each column 300 pixels wide. Let's give that a look. Still nothing yet. The next thing I want to do is I want to add a height to my rows. Okay, so I'm going to do grid auto rows. And I'm going to make these rows 300 pixels high. And if we jump back now, we see a big giant blue box. This is not just one cell. So I'm going to bring up my element inspector here. And I'm going to expand this game div. And if I hover over these cells, you'll see they're all individual squares, right? But they're all kind of stuck on each other. So they give this impression that it's just one big blue cell. Not quite what we want. We want to add some white space between these cells. So how about we do that? We're going to do that quite simply by adding a gap between all of these cells. So I'm just going to give this class a gap property. And let's make the gap 10 pixels. And we'll jump back here and we have something a bit nicer. So we can see some space between these cells. We have our grid. I don't want my grid to be sitting in the top left-hand corner of the screen. So I'm going to do some stuff to move this over to the center. Just so it looks a little bit nicer. So some of the things I'm going to do here, I'm going to apply an automatic margin. Okay. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to add a position. I'm going to say position relative. And I'm going to add an overall width to my grid. I'm going to say width, and I'm going to make that 920 pixels. I'm going to jump back here, and now I'm going to see that I've got this grid pretty much in the center of my screen, right? Not bad, almost there. The next thing I want to do here is I want to give myself some breathing room at the top. I don't want my user to come in here and try and click one of these top cells and end up clicking into their URL bar or clicking the refresh button. It's not very user-friendly. So I'm just going to add a little bit of a margin on top. Okay, so I'm going to do margin top. And let's go with 50 pixels and see what that looks like. Nice. That's a little bit much. I've got too much space at top and not enough at the bottom. So let me just try splitting this in half. I'll do 25 pixels. That looks a little bit better. That's around about in the middle of the screen. That's what I want. So we've got all these cells. We've applied some CSS style to them, and we've got something displaying on our web page, which is great. I can't click on them. I can't do anything. It's just a bunch of blue squares. So the next thing I want to do is start writing some JavaScript to make things a little bit more interactive. Before I go there, do we have any questions so far? Any interesting things we could answer?
Sorry, I'm here. I'm not sure why my video was stopped for a second.
Questions over
I know, I got distracted. Yes, a question from Eric says, the script element to load JavaScript, could you put it into the bottom of the page to make it only run when the page is reloaded, or is there something that makes this not smart?
Yes, I can move this right to the bottom after all of my HTML. Stick this down here. And this does the job just fine as well. So this will be okay. Because we have this defer attribute here, we don't need to do this anymore. So we used to have to do this. We never used to have this defer attribute. So any scripts we wanted to load that would change elements on the page, we would stick the script tag right at the bottom of the HTML document to make sure the HTML was created before the JavaScript. Now that we have this defer, we can just stick this right in the head where everything else goes. And it just keeps things a little bit nicer. Good question.
Cool. One more question. How did you move the grid to the center, says Adrian?
Centering things is one of the hardest things, right? So let me have a look at the property I wanted here. Let me get rid of this position. That's not the one that did it.
Yeah, it'll be width and margin, the combination of the two.
So my width and margin are the things that are really doing this. Centering things is hard. So I've added a width to my grid. So I've made, you can't see it here, but if I hover over this, we'll see that this has a width of 920. And then I'm going to add an automatic margin to it. So it just moves it to the center of the screen. This is one of the hardest things in programming, to be honest. Good question.
Nice. How do you quickly comment out things on VS Code?
Another great question. So you have a nice little shortcut command for that. So if you want to comment out just one line of code, doesn't matter if it's HTML, CSS, or JavaScript, you can just put your cursor on the line you want to comment out, hold Control if you're on Windows or Command if you're on Mac, and then press /. That's going to comment out that line. You can press it again, and that will uncomment the line. And if you want to comment out large amounts of lines, you can just highlight everything you want to comment out and use the same command, and that will comment out everything you've highlighted. You can press it again, and that will uncomment.
Nice.
Great question. Just to show that in HTML, I'm going to comment these out. Same thing.
Cool.
Okay. So let's write some JavaScript. I've created 9 cells here. I'm not happy with this. I don't like that I've had to repeat myself 9 times here. And we learned yesterday that there is a way to create things. There is a way to repeat code as many times as we want, right? So I should only want to write this one time. And then I'm just going to tell my code to do that as many times as I need it to. We used for loops to do that kind of thing. So that's what I'm going to do in my index.js file. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create a function. And this function is going to be the thing that's responsible for creating our grid and then adding all of the stuff into it that we need. So I'm going to call this function drawBoard. This is the function we're going to use to draw our tic-tac-toe board. And then right down here, I'm just going to call this function. I'm going to tell this function to run. At the minute, it doesn't do anything. We haven't given it any logic. So what I'm going to do in here is I'm going to create one of these divs in JavaScript. So I'm going to create a constant variable. I'm going to call this cell, and that's going to be equal to document.createElement. And the element I want to create is a div. I also want to add a class to this element. So over here in my HTML, I've added a cell class to my divs. So I'm going to do cell.classList, give me your class list. And then I'm going to say .add. I want to add something to this list. And I'm going to add the cell class to this element. And the next thing I'm going to do is I want to add this cell to my overall game element, right? So I've already got this game div here. So the next thing I'm going to have to do is bring in my game div. So I'm going to create another variable right at the top of this function, and I'm going to call this game element. And that's going to be equal to document.querySelector. This is how we grab an element from HTML that's already been created. And I'm going to use the .game CSS class to identify this thing. Now that I've pulled this in, I can add this cell to that game element. Right at the bottom of my function, I can do game element append, and then I'm going to give it my cell. So I've created a cell, I've added a CSS class to it, I've pulled in my game element, and then I've added my cell to that game element. Now, if I head back to my screen here, I'll see that I've got 10 cells. So I've still got the original 9 that I created in HTML. And now I've got one more. So I should be able to repeat this code now. So I'm going to get rid of all of these cells. So I end up with just an empty HTML file with a single div in it, just my game div. I'll look in here and I've got this one cell now that I've created through JavaScript. So now that I've created one cell in JavaScript, I'm able to repeat this, right? I can write a loop to repeat this logic as many times as I wanted to. So just down here, I'm going to create a for loop. So I'm going to write for. I'm going to use some opening and closing parentheses and then some opening and closing curly braces. The code inside the curly braces is what's going to get repeated, but I need some information to tell my for loop how to run. So the first thing I'm going to do is create a variable, and I'm going to start at 0. Okay, so this is the thing that I'm going to use to keep track of where my loop is as it's running. The next section I need for my for loop is the condition that will be either true or false, and that will determine if the for loop should run on its current iteration. So I'm going to say is I less than 9. So we're going to go 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And at the end of every iteration, I'm going to increase I by 1. So I could do I equals I plus 1, or I could use the shorthand I plus plus, which does exactly the same thing, increases I by 1. Just to make sure that I've written this for loop correctly, I'm just going to console log out I, just to make sure that I've done this right. I'm going to open up my console, and here we go, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Fantastic. So now that I know that this is running, the next thing I'm going to do is move this code in here into my for loop. So this is me creating the cell. I'm adding the cell class to it, and then I'm appending the cell to my game element. Now, I haven't pulled in the query selector into my loop because I only need to do that one time. I don't need to pull it in more than once. So now that I've moved this code into a loop that runs 9 times, I get my grids, my cells in the grid. 9 little squares, which is a great first start. In doing this, I've managed to get rid of all of these HTML cells. You can imagine if we had a 20 by 20 grid, I wouldn't want to create that many divs in my HTML. I would only have to write this much code to make that happen. Maybe I want to create a chessboard, something like that. Super useful. I think that's probably a good time to pause briefly if there's any questions, Ed.
Am I still? Yes, I can be heard. I am not on mute. Good. Let's go through a question. There are a number of questions. I'm trying to read through them again, but just trying to see how they can get it working on Code Sandbox. Yeah. So maybe if you have a minute, let's do what we did yesterday and just repeat the process of setting up that Code Sandbox. Sure. It shouldn't take too long.
Yeah, sure. I'll even copy paste all my code over so we can create it in there as well.
Yeah.
So I'm going to go to codesandbox.io. I'm going to click my Create Sandbox button in the top right. I'm going to create a sandbox, and I'm going to choose the static HTML template, the one with the orange shield. This is going to give me 3 columns here. Left side is where my files are, middle bit is where my code is, and the right-hand side is where my actual application displays. I'm going to create a couple of more files here. On the left-hand side, I'm going to click this tiny little page icon. If I hover over it, it says new file. And I'm going to create a file called index.js. And then I'm going to create another one called style.css. And then I'm going to double click these 3 files just so I can open them all up in these tabs in the middle bit. And then I'm just going to click this slightly bigger page icon on the left-hand side just to get rid of my file list. I can click it again to bring it back. We shared a link just before where you could go and grab some HTML. So you can find that in the Zoom chat. And you're going to just go and grab all of this HTML, head over to Code Sandbox and get rid of the HTML that's in there already and replace it with this HTML that we've given. Once we've done that, I'm going to press Control S to save the file. So nothing will change until you save the file after making any changes. I think I forgot to mention that before. So Control S or Command S to save the file after any changes. You should see a blank screen at that point. I'm just going to grab my style sheet. I'm going to stick that in style.css. And I'm going to grab my JavaScript. I'm going to stick it in index.js. And then we'll see it's kind of big in Code Sandbox. I am zoomed in. But we'll see I've got this happening in Code Sandbox as well. Just make sure that when you make any changes to any file, you are pressing Control S or Command S to save those changes.
Nice. Thanks, Nathan.
It's a pleasure. Any others?
Not for the moment.
Cool. Fantastic. Okay, then. So this is probably a good time to go into making things happen when we click on these squares. So at the minute, nothing happens. We click on these, nothing changes on the screen. We get nothing in the console. All we've done is draw some cells that we had in the first place when we wrote the HTML. So the first thing I'm going to do here is I'm going to go into this code inside of my for loop. I'm going to add myself a couple of lines, and I saw a question about this earlier. You don't need to worry too much about how much space you put between things. This is just to make it as readable as possible for myself. Some developers put everything line after line after line. I like to give myself a little bit of breathing room, and I just go by feel, whatever feels right to me. So I'm going to add something to my cell. I want something to happen when I click on one of the cells. So I'm going to take my cell here, and I'm going to do a dot, and then I'm going to call a function called add event listener. We kind of brushed over this at the end of yesterday when we started running out of time. So I'm going to say add event listener. Add has a lowercase a, and then we are uppercase the E and uppercase the L. This is camel casing, where you uppercase every other word, or every word apart from the first one. And then I'm going to do some opening and closing parentheses, because this is a function. And this function takes in two parameters. The first one is a string that describes the action that we're listening for. So we're waiting for a user to click on something. So I'm going to put click in here. So this code now is going to wait and listen. And when somebody clicks on this cell, we want something to happen. The second parameter we want to give this function is another function, because we want to run a particular function when a user clicks on something. So when a user clicks on this cell, I want to run a function. I'm just going to pass this function directly into this. So you'll notice I haven't given this function a name. Don't worry too much about this. This just means only this event listener has access to this function. Essentially, we're just passing it directly into here for a single use. And inside this function, I'm just going to do a little console log and say something was clicked. So what this means is that this cell has an event listener on it now. So when a user clicks on the cell, this function is going to run, and we're just going to console log something out. We're going to see something was clicked in the console, hopefully. So now if I head back to my browser and I click on one of these cells, I'll see I'm getting this in my console. I'm making some progress here. You'll not see them line after line because it's the same message, but you'll see a number here that gets incremented every time I click on one of these cells. That's great. There's not a lot of useful information about what cell was clicked, though. I don't want all of these cells to do exactly the same thing when they're clicked on. They all have their own individual purpose. So I'm going to change this message a little bit. I'm going to get rid of this message. And instead of using double quotes, I'm going to use backticks, because I'm going to use some string interpolation here. I'm going to insert some variable into this string. Backticks are available one underneath the escape key, but one above the tab key on most keyboards, right on the left-hand side of the keyboard. And I'm just going to write in here, cell number was clicked. And I'm going to put a variable inside here. I'm going to put I. I want to know which index, which cell got clicked here. So I'm going to replace number with a $sign and an opening and a closing curly bracket. Inside this little funky syntax right here, inside the curly brackets, I'm going to put I. So this is going to tell me which cell was clicked on. If I head back to my browser here and I click on the first one, I'll see cell 0 was clicked. Cell 1 was clicked. Cell 2 was clicked, etc. if I click all of these cells. So now I've got some kind of identifier so I can identify which cell actually received the click. So now I can perform some specific logic depending on what cell was clicked. That logic is going to be putting an X or an O into it. Cool. Before we go too much further into that, I just want to make sure that I've not missed anything before we dive into adding some conditions here. Cool. So the next thing I want to do is tidy things up a little bit. So I'm going to have some data in my application. And we talked a little bit about objects yesterday. Now, objects are a really good way to group things together, group related things together. In most applications, in most web applications at the very least, you will have something known as state. You have a certain state of your application. It has a bunch of data, and each of those pieces of data has some kind of value in it. And we want to just store those in one place so we have easy access to them. So I'm going to move my draw board function down, and I'm going to create a new object up here. I'm going to use const, and I'm going to call this state. And that's going to be equal to some opening and closing curly brackets. And this is where I'm going to store some things that I'm going to reuse that are related to the application's data. So the first thing I'm going to move here is I'm going to move this game element. I'm just going to stick this in my state. So I'm going to add a game element property to my state object with a colon. The value of this is going to be this right here, this document.querySelector game. Now that I've done this, I can get rid of this variable. And I'm going to have to change this right here. I'm going to have to say state.gameElement.append cell. And I'm just going to make sure that everything still works. Yes, everything still works fine. So I'm verifying that I've written some code, I've predicted it's going to work, and then I've verified that. So the next thing I'm going to do here is I need some kind of array containing some values to represent my cells in code. So I need some list of data, list of 9 things that are all going to be empty to begin with, because we just have some empty cells here. So I'm going to create an array called cells. So that's going to be a cells as my property, then a colon, and then some opening and closing square brackets. And inside here, I'm going to write null, null, null 9 times, right? I'm going to do this 9 times. Really, really effective code here. Now imagine if I had that 20 by 20 grid, or I was making a chessboard or something like that. Would I really want to type this out 9 times? Nah, don't want to do that. So I'm just going to comment this out, and I'm going to use a different way to create an array. I'm going to create a cells property, and instead of creating an array and I'm manually putting in all of my nulls, I'm going to use the array function. And the array function has a capital A, and it takes one parameter that we're interested in, which is the length of the array we want to create. We want to create an array that's 9 cells long. So I'm going to put 9 in here. And then I'm going to do .fill. I'm going to fill the array with something. And inside this fill function, I'm going to put null. So this is going to do the same thing as this line right here, but I don't need to type out 9 nulls. If I add a chessboard, I could stick whatever number that is in here, and it would give me that number of nulls. So I've created a 9 length array, an array of 9 null values. There's nothing in there. As we go through changing the state of our application, these nulls will change to an X, or an O. So these will either be null, X, or O. This is going to help us keep track of which cell has been clicked and which cell contains some data inside of it. So now that we've done this, we need to make some changes to our functionality. We have an event listener here, but we don't have any useful information going on. We're just console logging out something to a console. So the first thing I'm going to do here is I'm just going to change one of these nulls into an X. We'll just use X for now. So I'm going to do state.cells. So that's this cells array right here. I'm going to use some square brackets. And inside these square brackets, if I want to change the first item, the first null, I would put 0. If I want to change the second item, the second null, I would put 1, because arrays are zeroed into indexed. I'm already doing a loop from 0 to 9, though. So I'm just going to stick I in here instead. And I is going to be 0 or 1 or 2, etc. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to say equals X. And we're just going to use X for now. The next thing I'm going to do here is I'm just going to console log out state.cells, just so we can see how this array changes over time. So let me go back to my browser here. I'm going to click on this. And I see I've got this array with X at the beginning because this was the first one I clicked. The rest of them are all null. I'm going to click the second one, and I have a second X in my array. The third one, etc., until eventually I end up with an array filled with X's. So in doing this, I've managed to connect an array in my JavaScript file to the squares on the screen. So I can relate the two together, they can interact, and whatever's filled inside of the index in this array, I can display this on the screen. Brilliant. So the next thing we need to do here is actually put something on the screen when this happens. So what I'm going to do here, after I've added some value to my array here, I'm going to call drawBoard. I'm going to draw my function again. I'm going to tell my function to redraw the screen. So I want to redraw every single cell on my screen after something's been clicked. But this time, the cell that was clicked is going to contain some kind of value. Right? It's going to contain an X or an O if it's been clicked. It's just going to contain an X for now. We're just going to stick with X. Now, in order to make this happen, in our loop, we need to look at the cell, right? And we need to figure out, does my cell have any data inside of it? Is my cell got an X or an O inside of it, or is it null? Because if it's null, that means the cell is empty, and that means I want to be able to click on it. But if it has an X or an O, that means it's not empty. And that means I just want to display an X or an O. So I'm going to need a branch for my code here. I'm going to need an if-else statement. So I'm going to write if with some opening and closing parentheses. Next thing I'm going to do is do some opening and closing curly braces. At the end of the closing curly brace here, I'm going to say else. And then do another opening and closing curly brace. And this is going to be my if-else switch. So this if is going to say, does the cell have an X or an O? If so, this code runs, this code inside here. Otherwise, it must be empty. So run this next section. Okay. So the way I'm going to do this is I'm just going to say if state.cells I, the current index, I'm going to look at my array here, my cells array, and I'm going to say if the one at the current index I'm looking at is not null, it has some value inside of it, then I want to run this code inside the if statement. If it is null, I'm going to run the code in the else block. So if it is null, I'm going to move this click event listener inside the else block. Okay, I want to be able to click on the square if it's empty. Inside the if block, I'm going to say, okay, there is a value there. There is an X or an O or something that's not null. So I'm going to add this to the screen. So I'm going to create some kind of symbol, right? I'm going to create a P tag, a P element, and create a P HTML element and add that into my cell. So I'm going to do const, and I'm going to say cell symbol, and that's going to be equal to document.createElement. That's going to have some opening and closing parentheses, and I'm going to create a P tag. P stands for paragraph. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to change the text inside of this element. So let me just add a comment here to say, create a paragraph element. And then I'm going to say cell symbol dot inner text. And I'm going to set that to, right now, let's do Jeff. And then we'll change it. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to append that. I'm going to append that to my cell symbol. And then we're going to run this and see what happens. And then we can walk through it one more time. So I'm going to click on my cell. Oh, something crazy's happened here. I've created a brand new grid. This grid has Jeff in the top left-hand corner. Got some funky bugs going on here. It's very small, but you can see there's Jeff in there. I click the second one. Oh, I've got another grid coming down here. Jeff and Jeff. I've got so many grids going on now. We have a bug. Before we go and fix the bugs, do we have some questions, Ed?
Do we have some questions? Yes. A couple of questions here that I want to answer live. Number one, it's a little bit more of a step back process-oriented question, right? How do you determine, this is from Ing Chang Tan, how do you determine the actual pipeline when coding? From what I observed, it seems that Nathan went back and forth from writing code in your HTML file, then to CSS, then to JavaScript, and copy and paste the code in JavaScript to the condition. I can't quite remember, this is about 10 minutes ago. It seemed to be complicated to keep track of what to do first and after for a newbie coder, or is it just down to good planning?
That's a really excellent question. I love that. We cover that extensively in the course as well, because being a developer is not just writing code. There are so many other elements to it. You have to be a good planner. You have to take the time to plan. You have to take the time to break down a problem into very small actionable steps. So if somebody was to ask a beginner programmer to build Tic-Tac-Toe, they might come in and create a HTML file in a JavaScript file, and then they just blindly start throwing code at the screen and making mistakes and changing things until eventually, after a week, they had something that was kind of okay. What we teach on the course is taking some time to step back and really think about the problem you're trying to solve and come up with some kind of plan. Now, you don't have to come up with pages and pages of Word documents with loads of bullet points and images and diagrams or anything. Just a few notes for yourself to say, okay, what do I need? With Tic-Tac-Toe, I figured out that, okay, I'm going to need some kind of grid on the screen. And it's going to be kind of difficult to style that if I'm just creating it straight through JavaScript from the beginning. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to do raw HTML. And I'm going to create some kind of grid on the screen and apply some styles to it until it looks like how I want it to look. Once I've done that, I'm then going to repeat that exact same thing, but in JavaScript, so I can create it programmatically. So I do the actual styling first to get it how I want it to look, and then I repeat that, but in JavaScript. Every time I'm making a change to my code, I'm always jumping between the browser and my code editor. I'm always verifying that what I'm doing is working. And then you kind of build up some momentum from there, right? So it becomes kind of second nature as you get some experience under your belt. But in the beginning, it just takes some planning, right? Just sitting down and thinking about what you're trying to do before you jump into writing the code.
Nice.
Really good question.
Very nice answer as well. Thank you, Nathan. And then maybe a good point to go back through this if statement that you have, checking on state cells on line 12.
Sure. Let's add some console logs so we can get some visibility here. So I'm going to add a console log right at the top of my drawboard function. I'm just going to say drawboard has run, just so I can keep track of every time this function runs. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to add a console log inside my event listener for when a click happens. And I'm just going to say console log. I'm going to string interpolate again. Cell number was clicked. And then the next thing I want to do is I'm going to add another console log here. And I'm going to say, I added an X to the cells array at index number. And then I'm going to console log out state.cells. Don't worry too much about how I'm constructing these console logs. This is just to help me follow a trail in my console. And let's just give that a run and see what we get. So I've loaded the page and we get drawboard has run. I'm going to click on one of these squares. Cell 0 was clicked. So I've added an X into the cells array at index number 0. So cell number 0 was clicked. So that's the index I'm going to use to add an X into the array. And then we run the drawboard function again. This redraws all the board on the screen. And click the next one. Cell 1 was clicked. I added an X to the cells array at index number 1. So I've added this X here into my array. And then I'm running the drawboard again, redrawing the board. So now that I've added some things into my cells array, this is where the if statement comes in, right? When this function runs again, when this drawboard function runs again, if state cells 0 has any kind of value in it, we could say, if it's an X, we could be very explicit about this. If it has something like that in there, then I want you to draw something into the cell. Otherwise, it must be null. And if it's null, I just want you to let me click on the square. So this is where the if statement comes in. Hopefully that made a bit of sense.
Yeah, thank you, Nate.
Nice.
That's it for now.
Nice, cool. So where did we head off? We ended up with a nice little bug where I've clicked on my squares and it's creating a whole bunch of new cells. And we have Jeff in the top left-hand corner of the ones that we click. Nice. That's not what we want. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to add some styling to Jeff, just so we can actually see him a little bit better in the cell. So I'm going to create a new style here. I'm going to create a CSS class called symbol. And I'm just going to apply some style to this. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to make anything with a symbol class have a text color of white, so we can see it a little bit better. The next thing I'm going to do is just make the font a bit bigger so we can see it. So I'm going to change the font size. And I'm going to go with something pretty big. Let's say we'll go with 60 pixels. That should be fairly big. And we're going to add that CSS class to Jeff. Right, we're going to add that CSS class to our cell symbol element, our paragraph tag. So we end up with class equals symbol. So I'm going to do cell symbol, battling with VS Code here. Cell symbol dot class list, get me your class list, and add the symbol class to it. That's all I'm going to do in my JavaScript. I'm just going to take a look at this. So now if I click on one of these, I get some Jeffs. Still not quite what we want, but we're making some progress here. Before I go too much further, I've got enough information here now that I can style this up the way I want it. So I want to move this text into the center of the cell. I don't want it sitting in the top left-hand corner. So I'm going to add some things to my CSS. And then I can just leave my CSS alone from that point, for the most part. So I'm going to text align. I'm going to align the text to the center. And I'm going to go back here and have a look. Cool. It's in the center. I want to move it down. I want to center it vertically as well as horizontally. So the way I'm going to do that is with something called a line height. So a line height determines how high our lines are, how tall our lines of text are. Now, because have I given a height to my?
Yeah, line 11.
Yeah, 300 pixels here, right? So my rows are 300 pixels tall. So I'm going to make my line height 300 pixels tall. That should take up the entire space in my cell, right? So if I highlight this text, you'll see that the highlighter takes up the entire space. This is our line height, the height of our text. I think that's pretty much all I'm going to need. I may want to change the font size a bit, make this even bigger because we're going to have just a single character here. So let's go with something crazy, like 200 pixels, big old Jeff. Let's just make sure that looks good. I'm going to change Jeff to an X. Oh, what have I done here now? How did changing Jeff, the string, break things?
Maybe the font size.
Maybe the font size.
Line height should
Take this back to 60. Weird. Right, I'm going to press undo a bunch of times until we get back to. Well, see, that's just adding a CSS class.
Yeah.
Setting the inner text. Okay, let's do some debugging. I'm going to open up my element inspector. Have a look at my cells, and I'm not actually creating I'm not appending the p tag by the looks of it. Cell.append, cell symbol. I am. Interesting. Very interesting. There we go. Okay. I tell you what, right up here, I'm just going to get rid of this annoying bug that I've got where it keeps creating a bunch of new cells. I'm going to go to my game element, state.gameElement, and I'm just going to change the inner HTML here. Don't worry too much about this. I'm just going to set this to an empty string just so it gets rid of all of the cells that were there before things were clicked. I reload my page, and for some reason that's fixed things. Kind of. We get Jeff everywhere. I'm going to change Jeff to X. Give this another go. Why? Why would changing the word Jeff to an X?
I don't think it's Jeff or X.
You see what's missing here, right?
Trying to.
Cell symbol. Class list.
Do we line 15? This conditions cells. What's the first item in the cells array?
Yeah, this is what I've done here. I put a 0 in there for demonstration purposes and forgot I put it in there. Okay, cool. So it hasn't worked on the first one for some reason, but now it does. Okay, cool. So I had this 0 in here hard-coded for demonstrations. I need to make that I. I want the current cell to be Jeff.
Yeah.
I'm going to try changing Jeff again to an X and hope that this doesn't just break everything again.
It shouldn't do.
And there we go. It's a very small X. So I'm just going to increase the size of that a little bit. Let's say font size 200. That was crazy. You get some obscure bugs like that in programming. It happens to the best of us.
It's always going to be one small little thing, a semicolon, a typo, or yeah.
Absolutely. Okay, so I've got some things happening on my page now. I've got some X's appearing. Fantastic. If I open up my elements here, I can see in my cells now, I've got a P class here, and all of my empty cells have nothing inside them. So I'm adding some P cells, some P elements into the cells that I click on, which is pretty cool. I can't believe that one stumped me.
It happens. It happens.
It does happen. I'm going to get rid of my console logs here just to tidy things up a little bit. They've served their purpose. I'm going to get rid of them. Now, I don't want to add X into every single one of them, right? I want to add either an X or an O. It's not a very interesting game if X is the only player. So I'm going to need a way to keep track of whether it's X's turn or O's turn, so I can put the relevant thing into the cell. So the way I'm going to do this is I'm going to add something to my state, and I'm going to add something called symbols. And this is going to be an array, and this array is only going to have two things inside. Okay, the first one is going to be a string with O inside. The second one is going to be a string with an X inside. So I have O and X. These are the available symbols for my player. Okay. So what we can do now is we briefly touched on an array method yesterday called reverse, if I want to reverse an array. So in my code, when I click on one of these cells, I can take this value here, put it into the cell, and then reverse the array. So then the X moves over here. And I can do that on every click. So it will always take the first item from the array, and then it's going to reverse the array. So X will then move back to where it was before. It's a really interesting way to handle turn-based systems. Ed came up with this one. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to get I'm going to reverse the array. I'm going to say state.symbols.reverse. And then I'm going to set my cell, the content in my cell, not to an X. I'm going to set it to state.symbols and just get the first item. So this is going to be either an X or an O. That's all the changes I'm going to make here. And I'm just going to go and make sure that this does its job. Open up my console. I get an X. I get an X. I get an X. So I've got a bug somewhere. That's right here. So I'm setting the inner text to an X. But if I add a little console log inside this function for state.cells, I will see that even though the X is being displayed on the screen, I am getting an X and an O and an X and an O in my array, right? So it's not quite hooked up properly. I need to change this cell symbol.innerText. I'm hard coding this as an X right now. So I need to do something similar to what we did before. I'm going to do state.cells, square brackets. I want to get the current item, the current cell that I'm looking at. I'm going to stick I in here. And this is going to be one of these, right? It's going to be X or it's going to be O. I'm going to come back in here and I'm going to click. And now we see we have tic-tac-toe, almost, very nearly. We have our turn-based system going, but we have X down on the left-hand side here. So X should win this game, but we haven't told it. We haven't told our code to take anything to do with winners into consideration, right? So that's the next phase of this. That's the third phase we need to go through. So before we jump into the third and final phase, do we have any questions at this point, Ed?
Do we have any questions? A couple of people have been saying it's common to see mistakes being made and fixed. This is live coding, folks. It happens. And I always tell the students when they demonstrate their projects, please don't do any live coding when you're presenting to people. Always record and demonstrate it, because there's always something that goes wrong. But as part of the process of debugging and trying to go through methodically and finding it, this is part and parcel of being a programmer. You usually spend much more time debugging than actually writing code, and the rest of the time actually researching and looking things up. Anyway, Amir says, Nathan, how does setting the inner HTML property prevent the drawboard function repeating itself?
How does setting
the inner HTML property, like on line 9, how does that work?
Okay, cool. So let me just comment this out. And let's just add a console log right here to say drawboard has been run. Let's go and find out. So when I first load the page, the drawboard function runs and I get my 3x3 grid. I'm going to click on something, drawboard has been run. I'm going to get another 3x3 grid, but this one has an X in the cell that I clicked. If I click this middle cell in this new grid, I'm going to get another grid down here. So it keeps adding my grid every single time, right? So if I open up my elements, I'll see in my game, I've got a bunch of cells here, and it just keeps adding cells and adding cells and adding cells. So what I want to happen is I want to reset the HTML back to empty before I draw the new cells on the screen. So that's what I'm doing here. In a HTML, reset it back to just nothing. Get rid of the previous grid so that I can replace it with the new one with my X and my O. You can't actually see the original grid disappearing and the new one appearing because JavaScript is really fast. So it just looks like it's happening instantaneously. Which is pretty cool.
Nice. Let's find one more question. Could you share your current JavaScript code, whack it into the chat? I don't know whether there'll be enough characters, and Zoom chat is not the best place. But if you can try, and there's a couple people who want it.
Yeah, sure. Just give me 2 seconds, and I will sort that out. I'm going to take all of my JavaScript here, stick it into a file somewhere.
And while we're pausing, I'm going to send the link to everyone out very shortly for your registration for today. So please check the chat for that.
I'm sending a link to Ed, but Discord is loading it. There we go.
Cool.
So Ed is going to share this link in the chat, so you can just go and copy and paste this.
Cool. Can we go back over the symbols again? The 0 or O and X.
Yeah, for sure. So it's a 2-player game, tic-tac-toe. You're either an X or you're an O. So since we have 2 symbols, it makes it kind of easy to decide turns. One player goes after the other. It's not complicated like Dungeons and Dragons, where you've got a bunch of dice rolling going on and players can take multiple turns. It's just 1 turn for each player. So we can kind of think about that like a simple switch. So it's either you or it's you. So keeping that in mind, we can store our symbols in an array, our 0 and our X. These represent our players. Player 0, player X, player O, player X, sorry. And what we're going to do is we're going to set the thing displayed inside of the cell, inside of one of these squares, to whoever the current player is. So when the cell gets clicked, the first thing we're going to do is reverse the symbols array. Okay, so this is going to change this symbols array first thing, and it's going to put X at the start. And then the next thing it's going to do is it's going to set the current cell in our data array that we're using to keep track of things It's going to set that to whatever the first item in this symbols array is. So the first item is now X. So that's what it's going to set it to. Then we're going to draw the board again. So that cell is going to contain X. When the next cell gets clicked, it's going to reverse the array again. So this is going to move X to this side. It's going to switch these two around. And then it's going to add the first element in this array, which is O. And then it just keeps doing that for every single click.
Nice. Thank you. That's pretty much it for the moment.
Cool. Then we are going into the final leg. This is where things will get a bit more complicated. If you've been managing to keep up so far, I would expect to kind of maybe not struggle, but maybe get a little bit lost in this next bit because there's going to be a lot of stuff going on. So I'm going to get rid of my console logs just to clean things up a little bit. They've served their purpose. I don't need them anymore. I'm going to get rid of them. The next thing we need to do is we need to think about our win conditions, right? So let me open up my console here. And I'm just going to go through this game. And X should win at this point. We have a diagonal X here. We have a diagonal X on both sides. So this should not be possible. This is another thing we need to think about. When something wins, we should no longer be able to click on any of the squares. We should sort of show some kind of message to the user to say, congratulations, you won, and then stop them from being able to click any more squares. Because this is weird, right? Having X1 win twice just to rub salt in the wound. So we need to think about what our win conditions are, okay? The best way we can do this is by keeping track of all of the possible combinations. So one of the winning combinations here is if this cell, and this cell across the top, if each of these contain an X or an O, that's a win, right? That's a winning combination. Index 0, so this first cell in the top left-hand corner, index 1, which is the second cell, and index 3, that is a winning combination. That's a row. Then we do the same thing for the next ones, right? Index number 3, index 4, index 5, and the same for the bottom. So those are our rows. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create another piece of state up here to store our winning combinations. So I'm going to call this winning combinations. And this is going to be an array. So I'm going to do square brackets, and I'm going to press enter just to give myself some space here, because I'm going to add a few lines here. This array is going to contain arrays. So we know that arrays can contain a list of data. Lists can also have lists, right? We can have a list of lists, an array of arrays. So what I'm going to do here is create 3-item arrays to indicate our winning combinations. So I'm going to create an array here, and I'm going to fill this with the indexes of the cells that make a winning combination. So cell 0, cell 1, and cell 2 is the top row. Okay, that's this row up the top here. We can do index 3, 4, and 5. This is going to be our middle row. And then we can do 6, 7, and 8. This is our bottom row. So this is our grid right here, 0, 1, 2, all the way through to 8. Now we need to think about our columns. Okay, we need to think about these columns. And rather than trying to figure out what the index of each of these squares are, I'm going to use console log. So I can just click on each of the cells and it's going to give me the index for me. I don't want to do the work. I'm just going to console log out I. And what I'm going to do here is click down this left column, and that's going to give me 0, 3, and 6. That's a winning combination, right? That's our left column, 0, 3, and 6. 0, 3, and 6. That's our left column. I'm going to do the same for the middle. That's index 1, 4, and 7. That's a winning combination. Oops. 1, 4, and 7. That's our middle column. And then we have 2, 5, and 8. That's our right-hand column. 2, 5, and 8. I'm going to do my diagonals now. So I'm going to do this one, the middle one, and the bottom right. That's 0, 4, and 8. That's a winning combination. 0, 4, and 8. That's our left diagonal. And then the other one is 2, 4, and 6. That's our other diagonal. So we have a list now of all of our winning combinations. So thanks to this, we can check each of the indexes and check if these combinations exist in this array, all of the same value. So if all of the indexes at these values are X or 0, we have a winner. That's how we can kind of determine who wins in our game. So we're going to add a whole lot of code here. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to have to check for a winner at some point when I'm drawing my board, right? When I'm drawing my grid. I want to do this when something gets clicked. Okay, so if I click on one of these things, let's go through the process here. I've played the game, and then X is going to come in here. X has clicked this cell. At this point, the game should be won. The game should stop at this point. We should know who the winner is right now. So it should happen at some point during the clicking. So this is the area where I'm going to write my code. Okay. I'm going to do this underneath my drawing of my board. And I'm going to stick an if statement in here. So if, with some opening and closing parentheses, and then some opening and closing curly braces. Winner code goes here. And I'm going to have to check if we have a winner. So I'm going to create a function that does this for me. I don't want to throw all of this code inside of the same thing. So I'm going to end up with this massive long thing, right? I want to organize my code a little bit. So I'm going to create a function, and I'm going to, sometimes I like to pretend I've already written the code and then use it as if I've written it. So I'm going to create a function called check for winner. I'm going to call this function. This function doesn't exist yet, so now I'm going to go and create it down here. Function check for winner. And right now, I'm just going to return true. And inside here, I'm just going to console log somebody won, which is not the case right now. But I just want to make sure I've got things hooked up correctly. So I'm clicking, and I'm getting somebody won every single time I click on a square. Not quite what we want, but we're getting there. The reason this is happening is because this function here returns true. So I've got an if statement here, and I'm calling check for winner. Check for winner by default, because I've coded it this way, is going to return true. So this condition is going to be true, which means this if code is going to run. If I change this to false, I'm not going to get these console logs anymore. So we are going to have to create some logic. Instead of just returning true or false, we're going to have to actually do something in here to check for a winner. This can get a little bit complex. So what I'm going to do is I need to return a true or false. We know that much so far. What I need to do is check all of my winning combinations and compare them with the current state of my cells array, look at each of them, and determine if we have a winning combination of X's or zeros, X's or O's, ticks or tacks. Is toe the board? Is tick the board? Anyway, so I'm going to go and grab my winning combinations. Oh, my winning combinations array. And I'm going to run a function on here. I'm going to say at least one of my winning combinations has to be true. Okay, don't worry too much about what's going on here. Inside this function, I'm going to look at my winning combination here. So if I've got this one, what I'm going to do is I'm going to transform this array to contain X's or O's or nulls, right? I'm going to check each of the indexes that are in this array, and I'm going to change the indexes with what's actually contained, what's actually been clicked, what's actually inside of our cells array. Okay, so I'm going to create a new constant here called cells, and I'm going to map over my combination. I'm going to do combo.map with some opening and closing parentheses. And then I'm going to pass another function in here. And we've got some nested functions going on. Things are looking a little bit more complex now. I'll share the code with you once we're done with this. At this point, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to transform the data. Okay, so I'm going to get my cells array, and I'm going to pass in the index. Don't worry about being lost right now. This is getting very complex. It's totally normal. And then the next thing I want to do is I want to check whether this array contains what I want it to, right? So before I go any further, I'm going to console log this out. I'm going to add a little note for myself here. I'm just going to give this a run. And we'll see now I've clicked in this cell here. So this top row contains an X, a null, and a 0. This is where the complex code has come in. It's grabbed the X in my cells array and placed it into my winning combination array. So I can see I have an X, and I have a null, and I have a null. I'm going to click on the second one here. And then I'm going to get an X and an O and a null. So this is kind of representing the state of my board, right? I have a full combo here, but it's an X, it's an O, and it's an X. I know that that's not winning because they have to either all be X's or all be O's. But at least we're populating the array. So the next thing that I can do here is first check that they're all not null, right? So I want to check that my array does not include a null value. And also, I want to check that all of the values in there are the same. All of them are X's or all of them are O's. I'm going to use some new syntax again here. I'm going to use the word new and then the word set with a capital S, and then some opening and closing parentheses. And what I'm going to do with this is I'm going to pass my little array in here. And essentially what a set does is it gives me back an array, but just with unique values. So if I give the set an array with 3 X's in it, it's going to give me back an array with just 1 X inside of it. If I give it an array with an X, and an O, it's going to give me back an array that just contains 1 X and 1 O. It gets rid of all of the duplicates in an array. I'm going to call dot size, and I'm just going to say the size should be 1, because I'm expecting it to have just a single X or a single O. And that's how I'm going to determine if I have a winner. So let's give this a go. And we see now in the console, we get somebody won. We're getting there, very close. We've determined that there's a winner. I can still click in here though. So that shouldn't be the case. Shouldn't be allowed to do that. So the next thing that I'm going to do, and I'm going to determine if my game has actually finished or not. So when a winner has been found, I want my game to stop. I don't want to be able to click on anything anymore. So I'm going to add some more state up here to my game. And I'm just going to say, is game finished? I'm going to call this game finished. And I'm going to give this a value of false, because by default, the game is not finished. So it's false. And then down here, if somebody wins, instead of console logging something out, I'm going to leave the console log in there for now. But what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go state.gameFinished, and I'm going to set that to true. Okay, a winner has been found, set the game finish to true, and then console log out somebody won. So then at the top of this event listener, where I'm listening for a click, I can add a little if statement to guard myself now, right? So I can add an if statement to say, if the game is finished, I don't want you to do anything. I'm just going to return. I'm not adding anything after the return. I'm just saying I want the function to return, which means the function stops at this point. The function gets here and it doesn't execute any of the other code. So if state.gameFinished is true, this if statement is going to run, and we are no longer able to click and change any value on the screen. Right? We can still click on the squares, but they won't do anything anymore. If state.gameFinished is false, this if statement is not going to run. This code block here will not run. This stuff down here will run. So we can continue the game as normal. So let's just give that a go and make sure that that works. I'm going to click through. I've got a winner, somebody won. I'm going to try and click on the other squares, and we see that no longer are we able to put an X or an O in these squares. So we have a finished game state. There's a few more things we need to add here. It would be nice if we could have a banner to say, congratulations, you won. And we also need to think about what if we draw. So for example, if I do a draw here, I don't get any message. So that's another thing that we need to build. Before we go any further with that, that was a lot of information there. Do we have any questions about this?
Questions. Good stuff so far. Thank you, Nathan, and all these lovely things. So we have a question from Alice saying, what browser are you using like yesterday?
I use Brave browser. It's built on the Chrome engine, so it's exactly the same as Chrome with all the privacy stuff taken away from it. So you have your privacy back. It's got a built-in ad blocker. It stops things from tracking you when you visit websites. It's great. Just Google Brave browser. You'll be able to find it. Thoroughly recommend it.
Nice. Fatih says, have a good night, everybody.
Oh, thank you. You too.
Another question is, Roll20 on the home screen. How many hours in Roll20 do you have?
Oh, it's a really good question. I don't think it's that many. Let's go and have a look. My profile, maybe. Only 145. I'm more of an in-person kind of guy.
Awesome.
Good question.
Clearly, this is not the best method to scale up to a bigger grid. So thinking about the win conditions at the moment, and there's a couple of questions about this, but it would be good maybe if you spent a second just saying why we decided to do it this way.
Why we decide to do what, which way?
Hard code the combinations.
Ah, okay, cool. Yeah, so there are multiple ways you can do things. We could do it without hard coding these winning combinations. So for example, if we had one of those big gigantic grids, maybe we were building Connect 4, something like that, we probably wouldn't hard code these combinations in. The reason we've done it this way is because this is probably the easiest way for us to enable visualizing the winning combinations in the grid. So there is a difference between code that is suitable for teaching and code that is suitable for a live application. They're slightly different.
Cool. Do we have a couple more minutes for questions? How are you for time at the moment, Nathan?
Yeah, sure. We've got some
time. Not a question, but a shout out. Nathan is a top class teacher. I thought this would be miles above my skill level, but I'm smashing it. Thank you so much, says CGO Rourke.
That's absolutely my pleasure. That's the addiction I need to feed. Thank you.
Could you explain the last return you wrote, please, says Omar.
We can try. We can certainly try.
I think it's somewhat on line 60, probably.
Yeah, probably this one. This is quite confusing. Very confusing syntax here. So let me try and break this down. So what I want to end up returning is a single Boolean, right? True or false. So what I'm doing here is breaking this down into parts. Is I'm saying the array does not have a null. So this is the first part. And then the second part over here, this little syntax here is and. And this part is saying all of the values are the same. So these two conditions together will result in a single Boolean, true or false. So if this comes out as true and this comes out as true, we end up with true. If this comes out as true and this comes out as false, we'll end up with false because we have an and here. This double ampersand means and. Both of these have to be true in order for the whole thing to be true. That's probably as much as I can break this down on this call, but I hope that helps.
Nice. People are already scoping out on Roll20, by the way.
I shouldn't have shared my username on my screen.
Yeah.
I have a new campaign starting on Friday, so I'm not available. I'm sorry.
I've had a very lovely comment to suggest I am 21 years old. So thank you, George. I really appreciate you. And if you want to come take the course for free, absolutely. And there's another question here about why are there 3 equal sign? Maybe just double checking difference between 2 and 3, maybe we have some time.
Yeah, sure. So let me just go right to the top here, right to the top of my draw board. I'm just going to add a little console log so we can show. So I'm going to add a little console log and I'm going to say, okay, I'm going to put my name in here. I'm going to use 3 equal signs. This is not what I want. Let's probably start with numbers. Let's go with, what do I want to do here? Create a couple of variables. I'll call this var1 and I'll set this to true. I'll create another variable called var2 and I'll set this to the number 1. Then I'm going to add a console log here and I'm going to say, okay, as var1 triples equals var2. So are these two variables the same? Is var1 the same as var2? Is true the same as 1? And we get false, as expected, because we've used 3 equal signs. But if I change this to 2 equal signs, this changes to true. So this is saying now that these two are the same, which is obviously not the case. This is where the 2 equals and 3 equals come in handy. So 2 equals signs is kind of loose, right? It's saying, are these two the same enough? Are they similar enough? 1 represents a truthy value and 0 represents a falsy value. So this double equals sign is going to let me get away with some stuff, right? If I change this to 3 equals, this means these have to be explicitly exactly the same thing, right? So this needs to be exactly the same thing as this. These either need to both be true or they need to both be 1 for this to come out as true. So now this is false. We run into this with strings as well. So if I change var2 to a string, I'll put my name in it and I'll keep these as 3 equals. So is var1 the same as var2 with 3 equals? That's false. If I get rid of one of these equal signs, it's not going to work, is it? Not the best way to demonstrate this one.
For double equals, I usually use like a string 1 and integer 1 to demonstrate a difference.
Yeah. String 1.
That'll be true, but strict equality will
that's
be
a good
false.
way to do it. In fact, let's do 10 just for even more. So we have the number 10 and we have a string containing 10. These are the same thing, right? This comes out as true. They are treated as the same with 2 equal signs. They're not quite the same though. One of them is a number and one of them is a string containing a number. So if we switch this to use 3 equal signs, now we get false. These are not exactly the same. 3 equal signs is exactly the same data type, exactly the same data. 2 is a bit looser. 2 will go okay. They're kind of the same. One's a string, one's a number, but they represent the same sort of thing.
Awesome.
I hope that was useful.
Let's finish it off.
Yeah. Cool. So we need to decide when we've created a winner, we need to show something on the screen. We've stopped the game from being able to click on when we've got a winner. We've got something in the console. So the next thing we want to do is we want to actually show something to our user when that actually happens. So the way that I'm going to do this is by creating some kind of banner, right? I want to display some kind of banner when we have a winner. So I'm going to go to my HTML and I'm going to design some kind of banner. I'm not going to create this programmatically at first. I want to make sure I get it looking how I want it to look. So I'm going to go inside my game element and I'm going to create a new div. And I'm going to give this a class of banner. And inside this div, I'm going to do a h1 element. And inside this h1 element, I'm just going to put some text. I'm going to say, congratulations, you won. Yay. Cool. Let's go and have a look and see what that looks like. To make this work, I'm going to have to get rid of this line up here where it's resetting the HTML back to 0. So I'm just going to comment this out for now. And I get a congratulations, you won right up here. Not quite how I want it. It's moved my grid along. So I've got this one cell down here doing its own thing, having its own little party. Because this guy's moved in. He's budged everyone out the way. So I'm going to have to do some styling, right? I'm going to have to make sure this guy does not interfere with everybody else. So I'm going to create my CSS class. I've got a banner here attached to the div. I'm going to do banner, create a CSS class for that. And the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to give him a position of absolute. I'm going to give him full control over the space so that he can just overlap everything, right? Nobody else is moving out the way. He's just kind of sitting there now, over the top of everyone, shouting over everyone. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to add some styling to it. So I'm going to give it some kind of background color. And give it a background color, and I'm just going to say red. I'm not going to bother with a hex code this time. I'm going to check what that looks like. Not bad, getting there. I'm going to have to make it spread across the entire grid though, right? So I'm going to give it a width, and I'm going to do something crazy like 1200 pixels. Don't worry too much about that. We get this big long banner across the top now. It's not aligned properly, but it's about the right width that I want. So I'm going to just move it along a little bit. I'm going to change the margin. I'm going to change the left margin. And I'm going to give it a margin of minus 140 pixels, just to kind of move it along to the left a bit. So we've aligned it kind of in the center. Next thing I'm going to do is I want to give it a bit of a height. I want to make it a bit bigger than it is. So I'm going to give it a height of 400 pixels. And we have this nice big red box now. And the next thing I want to do is probably move it down a little bit, right? I want to move it down to the center, vertically speaking. So I'm going to add some margin at the top. I'm going to add a margin top property here. And I'm going to say, let's go with 200 pixels. Not bad. Nearly there. I can still see some of the middle column here. So I'm just going to bump this up to maybe 250. And there we go. This is around about center of the page. I kind of want to see what the cells contain in the background though. So I'm going to make this a little bit transparent. I'm going to add an opacity property here. I'm going to set this to around about 85%. So we can see this is a bit transparent now. Maybe not enough. Maybe I'll bump this down to 82%. That's a little bit better. The next thing I want to do here is I want to style this text. I don't want this text sitting in the top left-hand corner. It needs to look a bit nicer. So I have a h1 element here, which is inside my banner div. So I'm going to create a new CSS class here. I just wrote the word class. I'm going to say banner, and I'm going to say h1. So every h1 element, which is inside the banner div, I'm going to apply this style to. I'm going to make the text white. And I'm going to look at my screen. Nice, some white text. Verifying every time I make a change. I'm going to align the text to the center. I'm going to do text align center. There we go. And then I want to move it down. I want the text to be right in the center of this thing. Now I know that I gave the banner a height of 400 pixels. So I'm going to add a line height to this h1. And I'm going to say 400 pixels. That puts it right bang in the center here. And if I highlight, you'll see that this is now taking up the entire height. Next thing I want to do is just increase the font size a little bit. So let's just add a font size. Let's go with 100 pixels. Bit big. That's a little bit big. Let's bring this down to maybe 60. That's a bit better. Cool. So we have a banner. Now that I've made this in HTML and CSS, the next thing is I want to create this in JavaScript and only display it when we actually have a winner. So I've got this code here. I'm going to leave it in here for now, and I'm going to kind of replicate this in my JavaScript file. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to create a new function called, let's call it draw message. And in here, instead of console logging, I'm going to call that function. I'm going to say draw message. We'll pretend this function exists. It doesn't yet, so let's go and make it. And create this function down here. Draw message. And now I'm going to create my logic. And the logic for this function is literally just creating that banner, but in JavaScript. So I'm going to create a constant. I'm going to call it banner. And that's going to be equal to document.createElement. And I'm going to create a div. I'm going to create a brand new div. I'm going to add something to its class list. I'm going to say, banner, give me your class list. I'm going to add something to your class list. I'm going to add this CSS class, banner. Next thing I'm going to do is create the h1. So I'm going to create a variable called h1. That's going to be document.createElement. And that's going to be a h1 element. And then I'm going to say h1.innerText. And the inner text I'm going to use is just congratulations, you won. And then the next thing I want to do is append this h1 element to my banner so that it's contained inside my banner element. So I'm going to go banner.append and give it my h1 element. And then I want to append the banner to my game element. So underneath here, I'm going to say state.gameElement append my banner. And this has essentially created our HTML, but in JavaScript. So now I can get rid of this from my HTML file. So we end up with just this single lone div in our HTML file. This is everything we've done with HTML for Tic-Tac-Toe. And we've created everything else we need with JavaScript. So let's go and give this a go. See if this works. Oh, I have missed something in here. I need to uncomment this. Inner HTML equals emptiness. Just did that while we were creating the banner. And I'm going to win the game, and then I get my banner, and I can no longer click on any of the other things. So we have our win condition, and we're displaying a banner when it happens. There is one more thing we need to do. We need to check for draws. And once we've done that, we will have a fully functional tic-tac-toe. And I think we're landing pretty much bang on time here. So let's just knock this one out, and then we can have some questions and finish up.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so Go ahead, Ed.
Sorry, I thought you were asking for questions. No, we can definitely wait until you finish.
Yeah. We have one more function to write.
Cool.
And then
Nice.
So we have this if check for winner. We're also going to have another if statement here, and we're going to follow a similar sort of thing, but we're going to have if check for draw, another function that doesn't exist yet. And if there is a draw, we're going to call this draw message function. So we're going to show that banner, and we're going to set the game finished state to true. And now the first thing we need to do here is create this check for draw function. I'm going to do this down here, just above my check for winner function. Doesn't matter where I put it. This one is going to be much simpler, right? So a draw exists if every single cell on this grid has been taken up and there is not a winner yet, right? If all of these cells contain something that is not null, is not emptiness, then we have a draw. That's our draw condition. So with that in mind, all we need to do here is return a true or false. And to get that true or false, I'm going to check state.cells, my cells array. Oh. The thing that contains all of my nulls and x's and zeros. I'm going to check state.cells, and I'm going to say, okay, every single thing in that array needs to be some value. It needs to be not null. So I'm going to pass a function in here. And I'm going to say cell is not equal to null. That's our draw condition. And that's pretty much all it is. We'll share this code as well soon. So let's give this a go. Let's create a draw. Boom. Congratulations, you won. Not quite. Nearly. I just want to check that my winning still works as well. Yep, so that works as well. We just need to change the message depending on whether we're winning or drawing, right? So if we look at our draw message function, we've hard-coded in this function, congratulations, you won, as a string. And we're adding that to the inner text of the H1 element. I can probably use a parameter for this, right? I can give my draw message function some kind of parameter and replace this text with that parameter. And then when I'm calling the function, I can stick my message in here, right? So in this call, I can say, use this message, congratulations, you won. And this one, I can say, let's use double quotes because I'm going to use an apostrophe in here. It's a draw. And then let's give this a crack. Oops. X wins, congratulations, you won. And then let's do a draw and cross our fingers. It's a draw. Boom. We have a fully functional tic-tac-toe. Nice. So I think now that pretty much ends it, Ed. So we can go in for questions and closing up and sharing the code.
Nice. We've got about 5 minutes left, so we'll do maybe 1 or 2 questions, and then Patrick, if you're still here, hopefully you are, I'll hand over to you. Otherwise, I'll wrap things up. Patrick is here. Fantastic. So I have a question, maybe a little bit earlier, that someone was interested in you, Nathan. I thought might be a good question to ask live. Nathan, how long did it take you to get to where you are in your sort of software development career? They said that you mentioned you were a chef before. Are you self-taught?
Really, really good question. Hopefully this will give you some inspiration as well. So I've been coding now for around about 12 years. I'm starting to lose count at this point. I did not go to university. I did not go to high school. I went to high school, sorry. I didn't go to 6th form in high school. In my GCSEs, I got an F in IT. So I failed my information technology GCSE because I didn't like school. I didn't think it was an effective way to teach anybody, just kind of throwing information at people and expecting them to memorize it. I went and was a working musician for a while. That was pretty fun. Then I was told I needed a proper job, so I started learning to be a chef. Hated it, hated standing on my feet all day, wasn't mentally stimulating. I had a knack for computers, so I just kind of discovered this this view page source button in my internet browser one day, and it interested me, right? I was just like, oh, this looks pretty good. And it just kind of snowballed from there. I didn't have YouTube tutorials or university or anything. I just had my head in books and wrote code, made lots and lots and lots of mistakes, put lots of hours in. I was determined. And then eventually I managed to land my first job as a web developer, building terrible websites for terrible people. And it just kind of went from there. And eventually a big company scooped me up, Accenture. And that's really the thing that skyrocketed my career. And that's where most of the learning happened for me. It was on the job.
Nice. Everyone say that's lovely. It's amazing. Good stuff. Yeah. Another general question, and I'm going to hand over to Patrick so we can wrap up. Will you need equipment to get a job, or will the companies you work provide some?
Can you repeat that question?
General question, in order to get a job, do you need to have good equipment, or will you be able to get equipment?
Brilliant question. Really, it kind of depends. It's kind of a loaded answer, I know, but it depends on the company. If you're going to work in an office every single day, the company will more than likely provide the equipment for you. If you're a junior developer, I wouldn't expect the equipment to be really top grade. They'll give you something that's workable for sure. That kind of increases as you go through your career. When you get to senior level, generally they will ask you what kind of equipment you want. What laptop do you want? What's going to make your job as easy as possible? If you go into contracting, which is what I do for Boolean, you'll have to provide your own equipment. So I have to buy my own laptop and my own tools. Most of the time, equipment will be provided to you. I've never worked anywhere where they've expected me to bring my own laptop in. Things might be different now that we're all working from home. I'm not too sure. I haven't been exposed to working in a company as an employee since the whole coronavirus thing happened.
Cool. Thank you for that answer. I hope that sheds a little bit of light. And definitely, if you're interested in hearing more about these, come to the open day tomorrow to hear a little bit more about Boolean courses and chat to some students and chat to staff members as well. I've shared some links to the finished code. I'll just share them again. If you've just rejoined us, you lost access to the chat, and it's going to be back in the message. So if you want to go double check the finished version of the code, please go to these links here. Go check your chat. I'm also going to reshare the registration link for today's session one more time. Here we are. So again, thank you everyone for attending the session. We've got still a lovely number of participants. We're about 650, and we'll hopefully see you all tomorrow and Friday as well to finish up with Space Invaders, which I'm really looking forward to spending some time there on and getting that done as well. So a huge thank you to Nathan for being an absolutely amazing star going through this. I said yesterday, your voice is lovely to listen to, very calm, very melodic, and it was equally up to the task today. So fantastic job with that. Patrick, over to you.
Thanks, Ed. You stole my thunder. I've got nothing to add. So comprehensive was your outro. No, we've got everything. Recordings coming tomorrow. The registration form is in the chat. Please do come along to the open day tomorrow if you've got any questions about our full-time courses and our part-time courses. We'd love to see lots of you there as well. We're really excited that so many of you are deciding to take your first steps into coding, and if this feels like something that you want to take even further as a potential career, then our full-time courses are definitely a great option for you. So come along tomorrow. We're going to be talking about in more detail about how those work, answering all of your questions, etc. And otherwise, yeah, we'll be really excited to wrap up this week on Friday with Space Invaders. So thanks again, everyone. Thanks again, Nathan. Thanks again, Ed. And we'll see you all tomorrow.
Awesome.
Thanks.
Lovely. See you, folks.